Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next session of our seminar series. We're very excited. We were just discussing this before of having not only three tremendous speakers, but also our first panel of only three famous speakers. And I think that is very telling of the sort of directions that we want our conversation to take, not only today, but for the rest of our seminar series. The broad issue we want to tackle today is anti-colonial imaginations of the international. And for that reason, we have convened, I think, a panel with three leading scholars that are doing very interesting work in the boundaries of international law and global history. Sophie, would you like to introduce the first of the speakers?
Yeah, so our first speaker today is Sarah Dunstan. So Sarah Dunstan is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow based at Queen Mary University, in London. So she's broadly interested in ideas about rights, race, and international order in the 20th century French, British, and American empires. So her first monograph, entitled Race, Rights and Reform, Black Activism in the French Empire and the United States from World War I to the Cold War, was recently published by Cambridge University Press.
Now it is my pleasure to introduce Vasuki Nisaya, who is a professor at practice at NYU Gallatin. Her main areas of research include the law and politics of international human rights and humanitarianism, with a particular focus on transitional justice. She has widely published on the history and politics of human rights, and she was one of the editors of the recently published volume, Bandung, Global History and International Law, Critical Past and Pending Futures, 2018.
And our third panelist is Gozie Diagou, who is a PhD candidate in African history at the University of Beirut. So her PhD dissertation is titled Writing Back to Empires, Newspapers, Non-Elites, and Decolonization in the Global Public Sphere from 1937 to 1957. And yeah, I had the chance to be part of a panel with her at Queen's Mary in Toronto, and I have found her work really fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to hear her today and also the two other panelists.
But before we jump into the work itself and the questions that me and Sophie prepared for the three of you, I did want to say a word or two about the logistics. I see there's a couple of, let's say, recurrent participants in the room, so please forgive me if I'm repeating myself. But basically, the idea is that me and Sophie prepared a set of questions that we will ask our three panelists with the purpose of having a free-floating discussion for around 40 minutes or so. Perhaps later we'll try to open the floor to a Q&A. Sadly, Sophie will probably have to leave us early, but I'll be more than happy to moderate the Q&A and take all the questions that you have. And in due time, I will ask you to use the raise hand function or the chat so you can register your questions. The last thing I wanted to mention on the administrative side is that this session is being recorded, and we will later publish it as a podcast for those who couldn't join us in this very specific time this afternoon. I think that would be everything on the logistics side. Sophie, would you like to begin with the first question?
Yeah, so the first questions is about the intellectual journey of our three speakers. And today I'm very happy that we have three female speakers working on anti-colonialism in a time where we are trying to decolonize the curriculum and also the institutions. So my question would be, so as a female scholar, how did you came to the study of anti-colonialism, and how do you perceive today the decolonization of the curriculum? So Sarah, if you would like to start. Yeah,
of course. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. It's really such a privilege to get to engage with my wonderful two co-panelists. So I'm very excited about the conversation. So I guess, how did I come to engage with these questions? Well, my undergraduate degree was in modern history and French, sort of French literature. So I did a lot of American history and French imperial history. And so I was already kind of interested in those topics. I think for me, a real sort of lightning bolt moment was when I was on exchange in La Rochelle. which, as I'm sure everyone here knows, was a sort of key slavery port in the French Empire early on. And I was really interested in, I kept on seeing like street names around, like Aimé Césaire, for example, or Léopold Sédar Senghor. And these were not actually names that I'd encountered before. And I was doing French literature at the university there as part of the exchange program. And, you know, we're reading like Salammbô by Flaubert and these kind of traditional sort of French texts. And I was really intrigued by these names, and so I looked them up. And of course, once you start reading someone like Aimé Césaire, you can't stop. You have to think actually what the implications are for how you understand history, how you understand like French Republican history particularly, but also how you think about the frameworks for understanding like the world and what it means to be within it, right? And you know, I'm really conscious as a white Australian woman that my experience of the world is very different to the experiences that Aimé Césaire was talking about. And I very much fell in love with Suzanne Césaire's writings in particular, and the way that she engaged with the world and the way that she engaged with this sort of instrument of language, and specifically the French language, to think through questions of empire, questions of rights. And I really wanted to know more about that. So from a personal perspective, it was sort of falling in love with his literature and being really compelled to think through the implications of their writing and to think through what that meant for me and how I saw the world, but sort of more importantly, what it meant for how the world was structured, and also how we understood history, right? Like how different this version of, you know, French republicanism was from some of the stuff that I had concentrated on, which was heavily focused around, like, you know, revolutionary France and this Enlightenment era and these principles that, you know, people like, you know, Césaire, but many others were referring back to constantly, but which they saw not being enacted very much in their daily lives. And so I was interested in that tension. And that's really been a sort of guiding principle for me, because, you know, it seems very clear, like when you talk about the anti-colonial, obviously there's a multitude of experiences and perspectives that you're engaging there. And I think that's really important to remember. But I think it's also, it makes you interrogate in relation to the law, how different it is to be a subject or an object of the law, and what the implications are for that going forward. But I might pass over to my co-panelists now.
Gozi or Vasuki, do you want? Yeah. Maybe Gozi, yeah, if you want.
Okay, for me, I don't have as much of a profound story like Sarah, but I'd say that for me, I want to look at it from the point of view of silences. So for a long, long time, I've always been interested in silences, not just from the perspective of the masking of voices, but from the fact that sometimes people are not just heard even when they're speaking. And so for me, even though initially when I was, you know, applying to graduate school programs, first in North America, I was all about the post-colonial period. But then, in order to marry my personal and professional interests in education, because I have some experience in the industry, and of course, because I've schooled in different institutions, you know, so anything in education and literacy is something that I've always been fond of. So I wanted to find a way I could marry my interest, my professional interest, with a viable PhD project, because it's all about the sources as well. A PhD is not something you want to do forever. It's the best one is one that is completed. And so I found myself in the colonial period. And so I still want to make reference to at least one person, that is Dr. Huber at Freie University, because at the time she was working on, and she still is working on, communication. And so I was able to look at her work and draw inspiration from it, and also inspiration from people like Emma Hunter and Leslie James, who work from this perspective of transnational networks and newspapers. But in my experience, I'm looking at the bottom up perspective. And so I'm looking at anti-colonial movements from the perspective of women, students, and workers. But of course, all these groups are not homogeneous in nature. And so I'm I'm looking at specific groups even within these groups. So that's my story.
Thank you, Ngozi. Yeah, Bazuki, please. Oh, we cannot hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. All right. Yeah, no, thank you so much for convening us. It's a huge pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with all of you. I guess my journey is, well, I grew up in Sri Lanka, and that was quite formative in many ways. If I want to um, highlight a couple of things. One is, of course, when I was growing up, it was Sri Lanka of the non-aligned movement era, and so my earliest memories were of the non-aligned movement conference in Sri Lanka in the 70s, in 77, and so on. But also equally, actually, almost exactly at that same period, 76, 77, was when Sri Lanka also moved from being, opened its economy. So, and, just within a few years later, just plunged into a civil war. So there was a way in which there were a couple of different things that was happening. On the one hand, it felt like I had a real sense of the possibilities and hopes for sort of a pan third world nationalism that came with the non-aligned movement sort of represented, and certainly that was very much in the air in many ways, certainly in my home as well, in terms of the kinds of conversations around the dinner table, but also but also it was a moment where you could see Sri Lanka sort of implode internally because of internal and external pressures. So certainly the global market, the pressure to open the economy after in the late 70s, and then the alliances, both with the Reagan administration and so on, but also the internal implosion in some sense that emerged that resulted in the civil war. So at the time, I left Sri Lanka when I was 15, and at that time, I didn't think I had the vocabulary to put in to conceptualize this in some sense. But through college, I think in my college years, where I majored in sort of philosophy and politics, time that I sort of both encountered both post-colonial studies as an academic field, which allowed me to see in some sense, or allowed me to get a better sense of these dual dynamics of fracture, both internally and externally, but also in some sense to hold on to the hopes and possibilities that came with anti-colonial movements. So my grandfather was very active in sort of anti-colonial efforts. Those kinds of things then became equally important to me, I think, as much as the story of ruin that Sri Lanka began to represent in the 80s. And then equally, and perhaps as both, and both as central in some ways and adjunct in some ways, was I think my encounter particularly with post-colonial feminism. So I very concretely remember in college working through people like Gayatri Spivak, and feeling that it sort of opened up different kinds of ways of seeing the world, of unpacking what was going on in ways that centered both the global south, but she often says the international division of labor, but also, of course, the how questions of gender and sexuality and so on also engage and interrupt and complicate these issues. And then, it was all, I guess, in law school that I sort of then came to a community of people who are thinking through these questions, or parallel questions in many ways, from different places in relation to international law. So people from Kenya, from India, from a whole range of other contexts and with other histories. And it was in my grad school years that that trail in some sense came to be a catalyst. And equally, of course, many mentors who were shaped by and came from critical legal studies, that also I think was centrally formative to my own my own thinking, including my thinking about sort of TWAIL and post-colonial feminism in many ways. So.
Thank you very much. These are great responses, and there are quite a lot of things on the table that I think we can pick up later, such as silences, literature, or TWAIL even. We wanted to talk a little bit more about TWAIL at the end. Now I wanted to ask you a different sort of question, and is that in international law, and I think maybe in global history to an extent, there has been a discussion recently about the English centrism or French centrism of our work, of our sources. And there are many ways to understand this debate, but one of the ways I try to make sense of it is to what extent can we use hegemonic, let's say, frameworks, discourses in counter-hegemonic ways? In what ways can we use the master's tools to unbuild his house, to remember what we learned? So I wanted to ask you, in all of your different interventions, how do your historical case studies, how do your explorations shed light on the promises and the limits of anti-hegemonic uses of hegemonic languages? Anybody would like to start? I think Sarah?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick us off. I've just finished a piece where I'm thinking about this specifically in relation to English and French. And it's about, I started thinking about this in relation to language. Well, it's something that's been at the back of my mind, but Jacques Robert Menandra, who is a Madagascan politician and poet, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't have it in front of me, has this wonderful line where he talks about how the African diaspora speaks Bantu, Wolof, etc. in the tongue of our masters. And the point that he's trying to make about that is not that, not to embrace a colonial hierarchy, but that as far as he's concerned, language is a tool through which the ideological and political motivations of individuals can come through. So he made that comment specifically in the context of a Présence Africaine colloquium about whether or not it was possible to decolonize the languages of English and French, or whether they were too embedded with these hierarchies of race, these hierarchies of colonialism. And he very much felt so, because he felt that always, the way that anti-colonial thinkers and subjects of empire had used these languages was in a way that dismantled that hegemony, but also which showed how multiple peoples have always, if asymmetrically, constituted what it means to be Western, right? So he was making a sort of double-edged argument there, which is that not only do people have agency, whatever language they're using, but also that they've always been constitutive despite being put in a position of oppression or experiences of discrimination. Now, his perspective is not a consensus view in the colloquium that I'm talking about. In fact, it was an incredibly contested view, because there were many people who felt that you couldn't escape from the ideological apparatus of language. And I feel like this relates in many ways to the question that you're asking, because it's one that I think comes up again and again in the people that I've looked at, because they're grappling with this and they're not sure either if it's possible to escape that. Yeah, I'm going to pass the ball to my co-panelists because I'm really interested in this as a conversation.
Ngozi, Basuki, would you like to go next?
Well, let me attempt to answer this question. So I want to look at it from the point of view of the sources as well. And so even though the foisting of the English language in Nigeria in particular, of course, you know that Nigeria is a very diverse country with over 250 languages. So English was used as a way of uniting people. But at the same time, these same people use this language, especially in secondary schools, for example, okay, among students, they use the same language as a tool against the colonial authorities as well. And then English as well was a way of creating and imagining communities of readers, even amongst people who could not read. And so you see that even though during the colonial period, I think around 6% or write in English. Of course, we had other languages that people were using and could read and write in, but that does not mean the people who could not read or write in English were not able to access the news that was written in English as well. And also the English language was also a way of Nigerians to take this anti-colonial battle, if you may, globally, because of course, those networks were conducted using the same English language. That's the same English language, which was the language of the colonizer. So you see, for example, Nnamdi Azikiwe, who is sitting in the colonial capital of Lagos in Nigeria, liaising with George Padmore, who was sitting in London, okay, writing not only for the West African Pilots, which is the newspaper that I'm looking at, the local newspaper in Nigeria, but also writing not just for the West African Pilot, but for African American newspapers in the United States. Not only was he a London correspondent for them, he was also the African correspondent for a subscription service, the ANP, okay, which was founded by Claude Burnett and which had over 100 domestic subscribers at the height of the Second World War period in the United States. So you could see how the English language was able to create a much wider community of readers, much wider community of activists using the colonizers' tools.
Thank you, Basuki. Would you like to go next?
I mean, I think it is both. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Perfect. Sorry. I think it is both a question of it's both a constraint and a possibility. And as many people, one of the things I've found useful as sort of a way to think about this, and I've often sort of invoked this metaphor, is the metaphor from Fred Moten and Tihani of a toy box, of thinking about different kinds of the way of, rather than a toolbox, and rather than think of it as a master's tools, thinking of it as sort of toys that we can reconstitute every time, right? So that, you know, something that is a cricket bat can become a sword, something that is a piece of checkers can become in that mode, or in that sort of vein, trying to think about both language, I mean, as language, but including that we can reuse and take to different ends than they were intended. But of course, we can't completely escape those ends either. That it's always, in some sense, a grappling on both with both about the possibilities and constraints, and to some extent, I see sort of, you know, it's what lawyering is partly about. It's about, in some sense, trying to persuade alternative constructions of things that have been received in a particular way, or have sedimented into our sort of collective vocabularies, political vocabularies, a particular way to take it in a different direction. In a very concrete and sort of material way, it is certainly one of the I would say, motivating factors in the formation of GH&IL. It was that there was many people who were engaging critically and doing interesting work, but because of the languages in which they were publishing, or because of the fact that they published in venues that were not read by people outside of their locality, that they were not shaping, in some sense, our collective intellectual inheritance in the same way, and they were often relegated to the local. In some sense. So GH&IL was also about, I think, you know, by claiming an inheritance, also in some sense foregrounding traditions that had, you know, as Ngozi says, been silenced, or had not been visible and not been audible, in some sense, in sort of dominant international law terrains, because of either of those languages, you know, language as, you know, French or English dominance, or the language of dominant international law.
Thank you very much. Very provocative answers. Sophie, would you like to continue?
Yes, yes. I would have a set of questions because I'm very interested in all your work. So, basically, in what you are exploring anti-colonial imagination, decolonization, and you're exploring what many intellectuals, jurists, and also politicians have worked to craft ideological revolutions against empire. Then now in the historiography, when we look at it, it's many issues are nowadays framed into a North-South issue. During the Cold War, it was another issue. It was communism, anti-communism, and it has also a huge influence on the intellectuals, jurists, and politicians. And at the same time, it is also overlapping with empire and anti-imperialism. And so you have like you have different you have different discourses overlapping, which really create a mess in, and it really show that it's not so easy to speak about North-South issue. There are so many other influences. So I wanted to ask you, how in the case studies or in the figures you are working, how did they perceive these boundaries? How to craft an ideological revolution against empire? And I would like to be a bit more precise in my question. For example, Vasuki, in your case study, so in your book on Bandung, and especially you are in this edited volume, you are defining Bandung as a revolution, but when we put it in the discourse of communism, anti-communism, and how the Soviet Union after World War II wanted to be a figure, wanted to be a key actor in decolonization and is a question of self-determination, it kind of changed the narrative of Bandung. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think about it? And then Sarah, you are mentioning Aimé Césaire as a key revolutionary figure, but when we compare him with Ho Chi Minh, for example, we wouldn't say that he's really revolutionary because he was for the use of the French language. So it's kind of it's kind of problematic. So and Gozi, also about your case study. So you are working on this period from 1937 to 1957, and I wanted to ask you, so during that period, how did the people really perceive like the boundaries of imperialism? And so they were crafting a kind of utopian ideological revolution, but what in the end lasted, if we look at the 70s and the 80s? So that's my question. And so Vasuki, maybe you can start first, since you
It's an important question, and was a challenging issue for Bandung as well, because of course they were negotiating sort of diverse ideological affiliations even amongst the nations that had convened in Bandung, and accordingly even the document, that the communique, that the final communique of Bandung is ambiguous in many ways and limited in many ways, but also in ambitious and aspirational in other ways. So there was a constant balancing in some sense of both, and certainly it was on the one hand an effort, there was a tension, I think, throughout Bandung, perhaps a productive tension, but a tension between charting a third way that was neither east nor west, that was neither the Soviet bloc or the US model, and that's partly because of the configuration of who was convened there. And so in that sense, the charting of what it meant was a third way was important. It was also important, in a in terms of our political imagination, in terms of thinking about futures that were not necessarily had their end goal as either capitalism the way US defined it, or socialism the way it had become identified with the Soviet bloc. And so it was about thinking about alternatives, and I think that was, in some sense, one of the revolutionary dimensions of Bandung was, holding space for that alternative, that third space in some sense. So I think there was definitely that. There was certainly, I think, ways in which I think post-colonial solidarity, for it to be sustainable in a post-colonial world, needed, in some sense, for the support in many contexts of the Soviet Union. Presumably, if the Soviet Union wasn't there, we wouldn't have had, the Cuban Revolution wouldn't have been able to be survived and sustained, and then birthing the tricontinental. There were many things for which the Soviet Union was probably a conservative and constraining factor, but there were also many things where it was an enabling and facilitating factor. And so I think the trajectory of the Soviet Union itself is mixed, and perhaps attested to no better than with the involvement of the former Yugoslavia in NAM, in the non-aligned movement, and the way in which they tried to delicately negotiate these dual terrains of, on the one hand, fighting capitalism, on the other hand, fighting for a post-colonial, shared post-colonial solidaristic voice in some sense. And so so I think that remains a tension. As I said, I don't think it was always a negative tension. Certainly, at the end of the Cold War in '89, we found that a unipolar world was much worse in many ways, and certainly the aftermath of the fall of the wall was devastating to many contexts, and many contexts in terms of the possibilities of what was sustainable and what wasn't, including, of course, Cuba, but also for the tricontinental and its futures. So let me stop there.
Wonderful, thank you. Sarah, would you want to go second?
Yeah, sure. And so, I mean, my answer in many ways resonates with Vasuki's. I love this phrase of holding space for alternative futures. And that, I think, really feeds into my answer to your question. I mean, obviously, Aimé Césaire and Ho Chi Minh took quite different paths with their politics, but I think something that's really important to do is to take them on their own basis, right? And to think about them from when they were thinking, right? And thinking about the futures that they were imagining at various points in time. And I think someone like, Gary Wilder has a wonderful way of putting this, which I'm going to, again, butcher with my paraphrasing, but thinking about, he's particularly talking about, the end of World War II as this moment of like world historical opening. But I think you can think about various points throughout the 20th century in this way when you're talking about the anti-colonial imagination, because, you have these very diverse range of imaginations, right? And they're imagining possible futures in which differences of race, of culture, of religion can be accommodated, right? And for different people, these things look very different. So for many of the actors that I looked at in my book, this meant focusing on the integrity of sovereign states, both newly independent ones, but also existing ones. And it was about trying to get a guarantee in that way. I mean, Aimé Césaire is sort of famously hopeful that the French Republic is going to offer that, and that there's going to be a realization of French republicanism that actually includes everybody, rather than having this sort of tension of empire and racial hierarchies and gender hierarchies as well. So I think that is really crucial, I think. But I also think, when we think about what it means to be revolutionary, I mean, obviously that's a fraught word with so much baggage depending upon the context. But I think, you can equally have someone like Ho Chi Minh and his pathway and the way of thinking about, like, say, for example, communist political revolution, that is obviously very revolutionary. But at the same time, I mean, I think a lot of, a lot of the way that Aimé Césaire and many others taught their contemporaries to think, I think that's also revolutionary. I mean, you look at the tools that talking about this idea of a toolbox, again, to borrow from Suzuki, I think, this is a really crucial way of thinking about what it means to have a revolution, and whether it's an ideological one, whether it's a political one, it kind of looks different. I think what's so fascinating, again, to return to why, the anti-colonial imagination is so powerful and important, is that there are so many different ways that you can think about what it means to be transformative and what it means to engage with hegemonic structures and how you can make change. And I think that for me is revolutionary, looking at that broad spectrum.
Thank you, Sarah. And Guzi, please. Yeah.
Okay, so for me, I wouldn't say my answer is definitive. As you know, my research is still ongoing. But if I was to answer this question about the anti-colonial imagination, I would view it the way Mamdani looked at it, as a sort of mirror. And so if we look at how colonialism was determined, or how, sorry, colonialism determined the shape in which decolonization would look like. And in other words, Nigeria, as it emerged in the 1960s, was not shaped by the 6 decades, if you may. If you look at the introduction of formal colonial rule in the at the beginning of the 20th century. So we're not looking at it from that perspective, from that length, or from that period, but from the last 2 decades of which represents the decolonization period. That is what formed or shaped emergent Nigeria. And so if we're to also ask ourselves who were the winners and who were the losers in this, it was not the women who were at the forefront of the anti-colonial protests in the 1920s and the 1930s. Of course, they were joined by the workers and the rest. And then, of course, when the British colonial authorities could see that, they had to do like some damage control in the 1940s, if you like, with the development, and all that was happening in Nigeria. And then, of course, they're looking for allies that they could work with and who they could, of course, hand over power to. You find out that these early actors, okay, on the anti-colonial stage were essentially like sidelined, okay? And so we have, in my opinion, an unfinished anti-colonial imagination, in summary. So you see from the beginning, you had the nation, they're able to, the elite were able to mobilize the non-elite, the women, the workers, and all that, into a national protest, okay, against the colonizers. But then what happened? At the end of colonial rule, we now have regional power structures. And so from the national, you now have the parochial. And nowhere is this more, evident or clear than 7 years after Nigeria became independent. You had the Nigerian Civil War, of course. And of course, that also brought in the Cold War powers, supplying arms on different sides of the war. And so for me, in summary, like I said, you degenerate from the nationalist to the parochial. That's my response.
Thank you. No, again, 3 great responses. And I would like to continue then pressing perhaps a little bit further on this issue of the alternative imagined futures, especially in its relationship to international law, broadly understood. So I wanted to ask you if maybe you could talk about how your different studies show, let's say, anti-colonial activists moving, transforming, subverting, let's say, images of what we called Westphalian international law, however problematic that phrase might be. In particular, if they use, let's say, ways to challenge its racialized or its gendered ways of ordering. And perhaps finally, what role does human rights play in any of that? Or is it something that activists find helpful in their struggle? Is it something that is also comes with certain costs and limitations? I think that's plenty of questions for now. Gosi, would you like to begin, or would any of you like to begin?
Let me try to just jump in. So for me, my work doesn't really touch on international law and the rest, but I want to approach it from this manner. Nnamdi Azikiwe, who is the editor of the newspaper that I'm working on, the West African Pilot, of course, he tried to frame the injustices that Nigerians were suffering from under colonial rule in terms of human rights. Okay, so you can see that that played a prominent role in the kind of coverage that his newspaper, the things that his newspaper covered, not just in Nigeria, but also when you look at the coverage of Nigerian colonial issues in the African American newspapers, you see them always talking also from the perspective of human rights abuses. So you have forced labor or conscriptions, or of course, as well, we also have to differentiate between the grievances of who I call the non-elite, okay? The workers, the women, and not the elite, the Western educated, who are just a small proportion of the Nigerian population, and of course, who benefited greatly from the colonial structures because they had the education, they had the position. So when we look at it from the perspective of the non-elite, you see that women, for example, were talking about issues that they were present, they were focused on issues that directly affected them. So even within the Second World period and World War period, you had issues about price controls, you had scarcities, of course, even forced labor as well, because if the men have to be conscripted into the army or work on the infrastructure, they are left with the burden of providing for their families. So that is the way I would look at human rights issues from the perspective of the work that I'm doing.
Thank you. No, that's really great. Sarah, Basuki, would any of you like to go next? Perhaps Sarah, so we go in the inverse order than the last question.
Yeah, sure. So I think I would start by saying that what I found in my period, so, roughly World War I through to a kind of Cold War 60s, 70s, is that the way that the word human rights is deployed really varies wildly. So I think a lot of, if you think about self-determination, right, and the way that was a principle articulated by a lot of anti-colonial lobbyists and activists in that context of 1919 and for going forward, I think often in the historiography that would not be understood really as a human rights discourse. But for many anti-colonial actors, they described the right to self-determination as a human right, right? And they asserted, they laid claim to the right to self-determination on the basis of their humanity, and on the basis of it being something that, it should be a right that all human beings have access to. So I think in terms of a kind of human rights discourse, what I'm fascinated by, well, what I've tried to do with my work is to, again, use my actors and my sources as the starting point for figuring out what they're engaging with and how they're thinking through these issues. Because obviously, there's a distinction between the kind of human rights discourse that comes out of something like the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and the kind of, conversations that are going on amongst different groups. And I think the self-determination, the principle of self-determination is like a good entry point for this kind of conversation. Like if you look at 1919, for example, and I think you asked for a small case study, you could look at something like W.B. Du Bois's organization of the 1919 Pan-African Congress, and the way that he and other actors, like, for example, the Senegalese politician Blaise Diagne, framed their claims to rights. And there's a lot of slippage here in terms of what rights mean and what the right to self-determination means. Sometimes it means suffrage, sometimes it means something more concretely connected to kind of like a national sort of state or territory. But they do this in terms of what they see as a more traditional rights discourse of an equation between duties and rights, and this is often highly gendered in the 1919 case when they're talking very specifically about, male citizenship, right? And this idea of patriotic sacrifice of male soldiers and, many African Americans, but also many, Francophone African soldiers had died during the war. They literally sacrificed themselves. And there was a kind of discussion here about how this then meant that, they'd paid the ultimate price for belonging to a state. Therefore, they should get the political rights of the state. And so there's this kind of gendered discourse. And this is obviously, this comes up against, as Ngozi mentioned, there are plenty of women who are also at the forefront of making claims in this way, but they're thinking very much more in terms of, well, yes, political rights are great, but actually we need economic and social rights. Like, what about the welfare of our elderly? What about the welfare of our children? What about that kind of access to rights? And I think those conversations start to become different. So, in the context of World War II, I've done some work on GH&IL, who was a French Congolese senator who ended up as one of the French alternate delegates to the United Nations. And she ended up on the ad hoc anti-slavery committee. And there are all sorts of politics around that decision, which I won't go into now, but perhaps we can talk about in question time. But for her, she was really interested in women's rights, and she was really interested, like when we're talking about slavery, she was also talking about like marriage arrangements, for example. But that was not, interestingly enough, despite her support for an international institution like the United Nations, she saw that very much as a right that should be constituted at the level of the national. So that was something that she thought should be controlled in that way. So for example, human rights were obviously important to her, but in terms of the jurisdiction, like where those rights should be decided, she thought that should be at the level of the national. That's just one case study. There were many who disagreed, but I think those are interesting ones to leave it on.
Perfect, great. Basuki, would you like to continue?
So I think I'll, my own reflections sort of, I think will sort of echo things that both Ngozi and Sarah have already spoken about. That I think, with human rights, I feel like there is a, in some sense, we have a sort of schizophrenic relationship to it. That on the one hand, in certain contexts, human rights is really more of the same. It's about reaffirming and redeeming the international order. About in some sense through a language of inclusion perhaps, or through a language of sort of expansion of rights and so on, but in many and often in doing that just in some sense also helping to reproduce or legitimize the international order, but at the same time I think one for all its tethered as it is to liberalism and capitalism, and in many contexts, white supremacy as well. One nevertheless cannot dismiss human rights as well, because often for many people who are most precariously situated, human rights is a lifeline, and partly because they give new meanings to human lives. Perhaps they infuse it in different kinds of ways, and you can see, in some sense, in many contexts, a sort of periphery to center transformation of what human rights or the possibilities of human rights means. And I think one of the examples that sort of just occurred to me from the news over the last week was Human Rights Watch coming out with a statement that coming out with a report about Israel being a state of apartheid. Now that's as many Palestinian activists have noted, that this has been something that many grassroots activists have argued, using the language of human rights and international humanitarian law, and using sort of the history of apartheid in international law, that apartheid is the framework through which we should understand the situation of the Palestinians in Israel. But it was not, it took a long time for an organization like Human Rights Watch to also come to that point. But it's now that it is quite powerful, I think, as a way in which to understand, in terms of changing, in some sense, or at least recalibrating the political landscape of international law and policy in the international public sphere, in terms of how Palestine is discussed, and the reference points through which are understood, what is the language of normalcy and what is interrupted. It surely has implications for BDS and for a whole range of other kinds of efforts in terms of how we think about the life of the right to self-determination for Palestinians today. So I mean, and it's, so you know, that's just one example in some sense of of different kinds of ways in which human rights can also be tweaked. You know, it's not that it's going to bring liberation, but it does bring change that I think is still meaningful in terms of in a context where there had been so little space within the international public sphere to talk about Palestine. So you know, the future is yet to be written, but it is one example of not just struggles from the grassroots, but ones where sometimes those grassroots activists, it may, you know, it may take a long time, but they actually change dominant discourse.
Thank you, Basuki. Just wanted to say I completely agree with this idea of the schizophrenic relationship with human rights. I think that I and many critical international lawyers, Colombian international lawyers, are living it right now in the very aggressive protests and cases of police brutality that are ongoing in my country as we speak. But I won't speak too much about that. I would like Sophie to make the last question before she has to leave us.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your answers. And now I would like to turn to the question of your work and how you have worked on colonial archives or on the formation of anti-colonial imaginations. With which sources are you working? So as I have worked long in the colonial archives, I know that in France I met with many obstacles to work on Indochina. So I had to go to Japan and to Vietnam to work on colonialism in France, to work on crimes, colonial crimes committed by the French. So I would like to ask you, I would like to ask you with so sometimes we can see that which sources did you work, did you met with any obstacles, and also often we can see that colonial archives are subject to power relations and multiple interpretations. So how can we nuance these complexities? Maybe we can start again with Ngozi, because Ngozi, I know that you have published an article on colonial archive, which I really liked. So I found it. So I wanted to start with it. Yeah. And maybe we can change the order, Ngozi, Vazuki, and Sarah. And I will have to leave you very soon. So already I apologize for it, but I have another commitment. And so thank you so much for you being here today. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to hear your answer now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Anne-Sophie. So, but I wouldn't want to talk about the colonial archives because that is not what I'm focused on now, even though I will make reference to it. My work centers around newspapers, okay? And so, of course, we always have to talk about issues of access. And because, of course, because of the pandemic, a lot of my sources are actually digitized, but that also brings about the issue of what Rosenzweig in 2013 said, you know, in his paper about scarcity or scarcity of abundance or abundance. Okay, so now that we have a lot of material that is digitized, does the fact that we have all this information lead to more thoughtful or even better history? Because for me, if I had to use physical newspapers, of course, I will be able to see the debates that are happening, not just within a particular issue of a newspaper, but across several newspapers. And of course, I would restrict the number of issues that I'm looking at. But because things are digitized now, many historians now search for history. We no longer examine the document, you just put in the keywords and you just get certain results out of it. But then, of course, what do we miss in the process of searching? Of course, beyond the issues of errors in the metadata or misspellings and the rest of that, like I said, we miss the conversations that go on between newspapers, or the fact that because certain databases have their own unique way of presenting the newspaper itself. I know on ProQuest, you can search your searches come out in different formats. You have the articles, the banners, the adverts, the photos, and the rest of them. But then you don't see the wider context, because of course, if you have an article, for example, how does that article compare to the rest of the articles on that same page in terms of the font size, in terms of the location of the article, and the rest of them? So even though digitization has made things much more easier for historians, we also have to be aware of some of the shortcomings of using digitized sources. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
sort of emphasize in particular, and maybe this is also because, like Ngozi, I'm also going to sort of think through my sort of current work rather than sort of past work in thinking about the question of archives. And much of my current work is works at the intersection or looks at law and literature, and in particular about thinking of different reading practices that perhaps are in literature that I think are quite important and relevant and potentially subversive and when also exercised in law. So it's about different. So as Ngozi says, the archives may be full of silencers in different ways, and it's the reading practices are essentially about how to read the silences, how do we tell the shape of a story from what is not there. And perhaps in that context, I want to sort of highlight sort of two ways in which I have sort of drawn on in terms of my own work. So one is, contrapuntal analysis, which, as Edward Said described it, is an approach to reading a text for the relationship between what is going on in the front stage and what is going on in the backstage. The story tells us about what is happening in the metropolitan center that depends on what is happening in the colonial periphery. And for those of you who are sort of Jane Austen readers, you may recall that Said's example of contrapuntal analysis in Culture and Imperialism is Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, which is about the Antigua sugar plantation owning Bertram family, but with little mention of Antigua, even though their wealth and status depends on that plantation economy. And as Said says, if we linger with that dependence and that tension between Mansfield Park and Antigua, we read the drama of the Bertram family very differently. And this, of course, has particular resonance with trail readings of international law and the challenges of possibilities of, immanent critique within the belly of the beast, of reading in some sense what's on the front stage of international law in terms of what's not said and what's not as visible in terms of the backstage, and sort of, reversing that. And then a second thing, very quickly, a second sort of approach to sort of reading law that I think also, for me comes through, is in some sense enriched as a way in which I've sort of shaped it also through thinking about reading literature is, but is also, I think, a dominant tradition within critical traditions in international law, is what I would call sort of deviationist intertextuality. So as I mentioned earlier, I've sort of been critically formed in some ways by critical legal studies, and this is, Roberto Unger certainly speaks about deviationist doctrine, a reading of precedent and existing legal rules as a palimpsest where we seek to sort of reconstitute and reanimate what has hitherto been sort of marginalized traditions that have long challenged dominant constructions of legal meaning through generations of heterodox interpretations, although sometimes they lurk sort of below the surface and that are barely visible, and that require in some sense sort of archaeological project in terms of a reading practice. So in a sense, and people have had different names for it within law. Goodrich has spoken about sort of minor jurisprudence. I like sort of Unger's terms of deviationist doctrine, because I think it sort of in some sense foregrounds the political practice of reading. and of the political practice of how to read and unread an archive. It's much of it is about unlearning meanings that we have hitherto been that have been rested on particular legal doctrines, and thinking of those doctrines differently. And that's a essential part of working with an archive as well. So let me stop there.
Sarah, would you like to conclude?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to build on both my colleagues, I think absolutely this idea of paying attention to silences. I mean, for me, I found Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks quite useful in this regard, because, thinking through, if we're talking about people who are challenging the hegemonic ideas, if they're counter-hegemonic, then you need to look for them perhaps in unusual places. And I know that, so by training, I'm an intellectual and political historian, right? So texts, your starting point. But then you have to think, when you're looking at anti-colonial imaginations, often people don't necessarily have the privilege to have their words printed or, circulated or published in a particular way. So for me, looking at colonial archives, for example, like obviously in the context of the French Empire, Aix-en-Provence colonial archives were incredibly useful because it's all sort of in a central location. But I was interested in sort of trying to reconcile what I found in printed newspapers, in that kind of circulation, with what I found in, for example, colonial surveillance documents. Like who were the French government threatened by? Like what ideas, what movements were they focusing on? And it's interesting because often there's a total misreading of activists and activist agendas. And an example that I find fascinating is so Du Bois, his Pan-Africanism was of a very particular kind of elite, what he would call talented tenth, a kind which rubbed up against, perhaps in contrast, Marcus Garvey's more working class oriented version of Pan-Africanism. But for the French colonial surveillance services, both of these were lumped under the same category, which was German Bolshevism, right? Which is a very different, which is a misreading and a misunderstanding, I think, of what's going on there. But those misunderstandings are so fascinating because they teach you about, the different perceptions and how people are, like what threats or what is characterized as a threat and what kind of vocabularies are used to identify it. I think it's also useful because, people like Lamine Senghor, who was one of the tirailleurs Senegalese during the war, who then went on to, well, he was initially hired by colonial surveillance, French colonial surveillance, as a kind of like to infiltrate and monitor anti-colonial groups in Paris. But then he actually, was turned, so to speak, and liked the kind of activist communist thinking and became a key leader. But his publications are quite limited. He has a couple of really crucial and fascinating speeches and articles that he published, but a lot of also what we can understand about him and his intellectual and political aspirations come from what we get out of the surveillance files. So I think for me, it's perhaps looking in unexpected places. And I think, drawing on, looking at sort of national archives, but also then going to independent archives, trying to find personal papers and correspondence. And, a lot of the thought that you can elucidate sometimes for me came from, correspondence between some, intellectuals based in France as opposed to in America, and the kind of, they extended beyond more formal, I guess, occasions like the conferences or congresses that were organized. They also had kind of personal relationships, and, in diaries, you can find someone like Rayford Logan, for example. He has this amazing set of diaries from his trip throughout the French Empire in the early 50s, where he talks about all his, like, his contacts, and, it's interspersed with his absolute love of French food, right? He's like documenting but that is an interesting counterpoint to like the official reports that he then supplies to the Fulbright Commission that is giving him the funding to get this material for the US State Department. So I think to look in unexpected places and to really, as my colleagues have said, to think about the silences, what's not being said, really linger there and think about, what's missing or what is implied or assumed is really important.
Thank you. I think these were all great answers, and I reckon that German Bolsheviks would be the great name for a band. But I also was wondering, and I would like to now, seeing that our time is quickly, let's say, evaporating, to maybe ask if there's people in the room that would have any questions or would like to raise any questions. Me and Sophie also had a couple more prepared, but we would like to have the opportunity to have other interveners speak. I think that David has his hand up. It would be great if you could just briefly introduce yourself and then raise your question. Thank you very much for joining us, David.
Thanks. I'm unaffiliated writer, mostly in sociology, socioeconomics, and related fields or related areas. And I'm writing and sharing my opinions. I have sort of a combination of comments and questions. I take it you're all familiar with the section of the American Sociological Association called Political Economy of the World Systems, which is had been heavily influenced by the late Emanuel Wallerstein. What I mean, and I'm not an expert on that perspective, but my take on it is that the colonial period was what followed the colonial period is in important ways is not that different from the realities of the colonial period, because you have his analysis or their analysis is there's the world economy is divided into central zones and peripheral zones. The peripheral zones are often characterized as the global south, although, say, for example, within the United States, you can have peripheral zones in the United States. Peripheral zones tend to be characterized by extractive economies, whereas the central zones tend to be characterized by value-added economies. That may be a conclusion that I have drawn. I'm not sure, that I may be standing on other people's observations by making that observation. But the rules of the international rules allowing for extraction of, say, mineral wealth from the global south, which used to be called the colonial sphere, have allowed for enormous wealth to be extracted and not shared with the people who are, for example, miners, or even in the so-called Asian tigers, the people who are working in those corporations are getting paid very little and are being vastly overworked. So their work is being extracted, and the value added that they're doing is being appropriated by corporations and the wealthy members of the global north, most of whom are in the top 5 or 1% of wealth holders in the global north. So the only the basic, so that's, I mean, if you're going to develop a peripheral imagination, you have to start with a kind of basic analysis of what is actually happening. I mean, that's from a sociological point of view, as opposed to a historical point of view. Although there are overlaps between the two, clearly. So that's an initial comment or comments. One thing that can be done is to try and legislate internationally a pricing, like PPP, which is pricing power parity or something like that, to legislate minimum wages for workers in the global south, because and that would be helpful, because what's presently happening is you have a declining wage spiral, so that the reason that the deindustrialization in the U.S. and the West occurred was in pursuit of the cheaper wages that are available in the global south, and so long as they can keep shifting to cheaper wages, the wage base of the global north as well as the global south will continue to erode, and that will lead to problems for everybody, because of demand economic demand deficits.
David, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm just wondering if you can try to wrap up the question, so just that we have a little bit more space for the Q&A afterwards. So
All right.
maybe if you could phrase, let's say, the poignant question you would like to raise for panelists, I would really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm sure you would, and I'm afraid I'm going to have trouble doing that. I'm sorry. I've done. If I can think of something, I will raise my hand again. But thank you very much for your contributions. And it's early in the morning here, and I'm sorry I can't summarize better at this point.
No, but I think that's a wonderful contribution. It's to think through world systems and, let's say, through socioeconomic tensions, the sort of questions we're interested in. I was somewhat reminded of the recent book review by Apaurai on the future of postcolonial thought. Maybe Sarah Basuki and Negocio are familiar with it, in which he also raised questions about, let's say, what are an analyses of the material conditions of contemporary coloniality doing for the sorts of intellectual projects we wanted to pursue. So if I understand your question correctly, I would now like to turn the floor to our panelists to see if we have any, let's say, comments towards those sort of issues related to world systems analyses or socioeconomic deprivation in both past, present, and contemporary situations.
I'm maybe competing with my dogs that have have, I think, heard the cat move downstairs and up in arms. So yeah, I mean, I think world systems is really helpful, and I certainly think of both in terms of thinking about the international law operating what is often we sort of bargain in the background of a system that has many different registers, and whether and its battles on political economy, battles on epistemology. I mean, all these in some sense intersect and engage with each other, and what system is useful is also useful, I think, as David pointed out, in thinking not only in terms of North and South, but also thinking about peripheries within the metropole, and the metropole within the periphery, and so on. That said, I should also want to say that certainly in terms of thinking about GH&IL or thinking about Global South, we're thinking of the third world there as a political category rather than a geographical category, and perhaps this is actually not in tension with the world systems analysis, but that's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind, that it is that, so when we think about trade analysis, it can emerge from Detroit as much as it can emerge from Dakar. That there is a way in which it's about thinking about the distributive logics that are baked into the international system, without necessarily thinking of it in historical geographical terms. So let me stop there and show my other panels.
Yeah, I mean, I think that absolutely, I agree with Vasuki, and I would also add, just from if you're thinking about this relationship between the colonial, the periphery and the metropole.
I'm sorry, Sarah, but I cannot hear you very well. Am I the only one?
I can't hear her either.
How about now?
Perfect.
Great. So I was just saying, completely agree with Vasuki, and I think it's an important reminder to think about third world as a political category. I think I would add, in terms of thinking about, I think this idea of periphery versus colonial metropole or colonial center is really important, and I think perhaps an illustrative historical example here is to think about print culture, and to think about the way that, say, for example, Paris in the interwar period was a really important node of Pan-African, but also multiple other kind of anti-colonial sort of print culture and circulation.
Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it seems we seem to be having problems again. I'm not really sure why. Could you try again?
Can you hear me?
That's much better. I'm not really sure why, but thanks.
It might just be my internet connection. I'm not sure what was heard or not, but I was thinking in terms of print culture in the interwar period, and thinking about the way that one of the key mechanisms of empire was, curtailing the circulation of newspapers. And I was thinking specifically of something like, Martinique, which, they don't have a printing press kind of capacity for colonial subjects in the interwar. And so this is one of the reasons that Aimé Césaire and Suzanne Cézaire's Tropique is so important, because it's a really key expression of multiple different perspectives and anti-colonial imaginaries that's actually being printed in Martinique. And I think that that's something that, that's just one example of multiple different ones. It's not to suggest that there weren't these circulations, throughout empire, but that these mechanics of empire really do play a huge role historically in how ideas are circulated.
Thank you, Sarah. It was much better at the end. I'm sorry, and I apologize for the internet problems. Negosi, do you have anything to add? Would you like to say something? Um, Okay, now Negosi's texted me that sadly she cannot hear us. I just wanted to conclude that I think it's a great question, David. I am myself very much interested by the ways in which, let's say, world systems theory and dependency theory in particular were picking up by Latin American lawyers, intellectuals in roughly the same time periods that I think you have been discussing, and in particular how places like the Economic Commission for Latin America in Santiago de Chile became really a hotspot for this sort of world systems thinking in terms of international law, socioeconomic rights, and so on. So really, thank you very much for raising what I think is a very promising, let's say, theoretical framework to understand all of these issues. We have only a couple of minutes left, but I would like to maybe see if there's any last questions in the floor. If not, maybe I can just ask a very short one to have our last parting round of comments. I hope that Negosi's internet gets better. If not, maybe I'll just address this question to Sarah and to Basuki. But something that with Sophie, we also wanted to discuss, even if now briefly, is that to talk about anti-colonialism is in many ways to talk about exile. And I think your work shows how these networks of exiles, both in the metropole, but also in other sorts of, let's say, colonial spaces, were very important for the creation of anti-colonial imaginaries in both, let's say, political and legal projects. And seeing that the time is very short, I just wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about, let's say, this aspect of exile as a fundamental, let's say, component of the anti-colonial politics in both historical work and in both, let's say, the present that we live and we inherit. Any of you would like to go first?
Begin the conversation. Yeah, I mean, I think, in a sense, the experience of exile is, is both, on the one hand, people, literally being moved from, or people literally having to be away from the places or place that they that configured as home, but also but I think perhaps, and more importantly, exile as being in some sense a larger experience that is in some sense the permanent condition coming in after the histories of slavery and colonialism, in post-colonial studies in particular has theorized it in those terms, and that has been sort of generative in thinking about what does it mean to to consider the political as being from this position of displacement, and as itself being displaced. So going back to earlier questions that you raised in terms of sort of indigenous knowledges, different alternative trajectories of conceiving of community and emancipation, the exile being in some sense the sense and through which slavery and colonialism displaced all of those. In some ways, the ways in which sometimes the project of anti-colonial imaginaries has been framed has been as a reclaiming, like a return to home, in some sense. And so, walking back the exile. And I don't want to dismiss that completely. I think that is certainly one important dimension of it. But of course, it is not the whole of it, because the home is, of course, never there in the way that it has been imagined. And it's also about a reconstructive process and about refiguring sort of new directions as well. I think so I think again it's about the exile, I think, is one way in which to unthink the progress narratives of international law, and the ways and to think about things that were lost, and past that could have been had different futures, but it's also a way about thinking about, perhaps we'll go back to where we started, to thinking about alternative futures. So let me stop there.
Sarah, would you like to go next? Ngozi told me that she could hear the question, but she won't be able to turn her camera on, sadly.
That's a shame. Yeah, I mean, I just like to reiterate my agreement with Vasuki. I think I would add to that. I think thinking about anti-colonial imaginaries in terms of movement, in terms of travel and exposure to different things, and I think also thinking about exile in terms of an exile from a dominant sort of cultural mode or a dominant kind of framework is useful for me as well. And I think this is particularly true, you're returning to how the intellectuals that I've worked on, how they position themselves vis-a-vis certain movements, vis-a-vis certain countries, vis-a-vis certain experiences. I mean, James Baldwin is very interesting, I think, on this, when he talks about how he doesn't actually feel a sense of kinship with an African diaspora, because as far as he's concerned, he's American. It's just he's an American who, because of his particular phenotypic expression, is not included. And so he talks about what that means, and he talks about his experience of that. Now, and again, and I feel like I keep reiterating this is not necessarily something that you share. Like, there are other people who think quite differently, and I think I'm thinking here about the opening of the 1969 Pan-African Festival in Algiers, where the jazz musician Archie Shepp who's American, walks out onto the stage and says, "Oh, I'm home in Africa," and he feels this kind of connection to Africa that he's never been there before. But for him, this idea of Africa is important in constituting his identity and constituting a particular kind of political radicalism. And so I think all of these things are important to take into account when thinking about these imaginaries, and to think imagine futures, but also imagined pasts.
Thank you, Sarah. Ngozi, would you like to have the last closing word?
Yes, I will. And so, even though exile does not play a role in my work, we can approach the matter from the diasporic angle. So when you look at the shared oppressions that African Americans, shared with Africa, despite the changing attitudes that they had themselves, towards Africa, we see that because of this shared oppression, they help to amplify the voices of colonial peoples through conferences and through their newspapers. And then we can also talk about colonial student organizations as well in the diaspora. So, for example, you have the West African Students' Union in London, which were working, or the organization was working with their counterparts, not only in Nigeria, but other parts of West Africa, in this anti-colonial process. And then finally, in the case of the Caribbean, while the geography in total played a very small role in the anti-colonial process, we cannot dispute the fact that George Padmore's role was unquestioned in Europe. I will describe it as a London colonial intermediary, working not just for the Caribbean, but for colonies in West Africa and even South Africa, which wasn't even part of West Africa, but just for the entire African continent. So those are the three ways that I look at this issue of exile.
Thank you again to the three of you and to all of our participants for the wonderful conversation today. I think it really dovetails quite neatly with our next seminar session, which will be on May 20th on decolonization and international law, in which we will have Suravi Ranganathan, who I saw was with us in the audience for some time, Sam Moyne, and Milinda Banerjee. We're very excited for this session. I also wanted to say that we will be posting a call for papers for early career researchers or grad students like myself to present our work together on June 17th. So please do keep in the outlook if you would be interested in sharing your work with us. Thank you again to our three wonderful panelists, to David for his very insightful question, and to all of the attendants. Do see you on the 20th of May. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It was good to be here.